We are here to talk about state legislatures in 2023 and what happened in sessions this year. My name is Teresa Hebert, and I am the Director of Communications at Quorum. And I'm joined by two wonderful speakers with us, Andy Hackman and Don Bolia. Just a few housekeeping items before we dive in. The session is being recorded, so if you have to leave a bit early or you have a colleague you'd like to share this with, that will be sent out about 24 hours after our session is concluded. And again, we'll be doing plenty of Q&A at the end, so feel free to use that chat and Q&A box on the side to send in your questions. And now to introduce our speakers. Andy Hackman is a registered federal lobbyist with Serlin Haley, who's testified for the U.S. Senate and lobbied in over 25 state capitals. Prior to joining Serlin Haley, he served as Vice President of Government Affairs for the Toy Industry Association, where he oversaw TIA's advocacy program at both the state and federal levels. He also has directed the National Government Affairs program of the Consumer Specialty Products Association. Don Bolia is the founder and principal at Peachtree Government Relations. He provides industry leaders with strategic advice on legislative trends and assists them in shaping policy debates at the state, federal, and local levels in Georgia. Don began his career working for Congressman Newt Gingrich in Washington, D.C., and since then he has held several leadership positions in the Georgia Republican Party and in public sector roles in Fulton County before moving to the public-private sector. Thank you so much for joining us both.
Glad to be here.
Awesome. So our plan for today and our agenda is to have both Andy and Don talk about a few of the trends that they observed in their states that they work in this year and how that affects their strategies moving into 2024. So we're going to start with Andy and walk through a couple of trends. First, talking about one of the key issues that Andy works on, which is environmental sustainability. Andy, can you give us a quick overview of your work in this space and an overview of what happened this year?
Yeah, now I'm based in Maine, but work in a number of different states on environmental policy and consumer product issues. So it's been a real active period, at least the last 2 or 3 years. I think, as folks know, if you're on this webinar, it's because not a whole lot's getting done at the federal level. You know, the last major bipartisan environmental law that changed things significantly that I was involved in was the Toxic Substances Control Act reform that happened in 2014. And, you know, we've been now practically a decade from any real significant breakthroughs, I think, at the national level related to environmental policy. So obviously, the states have truly, you know, picked up the slack in these areas. And, you know, I think over the last several years, we've seen a lot of activity that's more nuanced than sort of blockbuster, major goal-setting pieces of legislation. You know, as folks will recall, in the 2000s, we saw major climate change goals enshrined in statute and sort of aspirational programs really put in place. And I think we're kind of in a second generation of some of these environmental issues at the state level. You know, you look at the climate change area, and there's more nuanced policy going on right now around energy siting and specific energy projects and electrification of vehicle fleets and what types of equipment can or can't be installed in particular areas as a way of meeting some of the climate change goals that were really set in about the last decade or so. And then on other issues that are a little bit closer to where I do a lot of work, you know, on chemicals, like I mentioned, you know, at the national level, there was an effort to try to reform the federal chemicals approach, but yet we still have significant activity at the state level. If anybody that's involved in making a product or good hasn't heard about PFAS and perfluorine compounds and the concern around those from a water quality standpoint, and the amount of energy and attention that's gone into trying to regulate these particular compounds that are in thousands and thousands of products. There are over 14,000 different chemicals that fit into this class of chemicals. And, you know, there are states that are taking action on this in a way that we've not seen since lead remediation in pipes and in paint and that effort in the 70s and early 80s. So, you know, the amount of activity is significant. And then in areas like solid waste and recycling, you know, that's not an area that's typically been an area of federal uniform activity. So I do a lot of work related to packaging, and a topic called extended producer responsibility has seen 4 states in the last 2 years pass new laws that essentially will have producers of packaging paying for solid waste and recycling of all of their materials. It shifts an entire responsibility for the way solid waste is handled to a new ratepayer, in essence, and has the effect of obviously shifting the way that solid waste might be handled in particular states. California, Colorado, Oregon, and Maine, my home state, was first in this area of policy, and it's something that I think is going to dramatically change, the way that recycling and your curbside service is potentially going to be impacted. So, over the last couple of years, states that have perhaps had a more progressive bent have certainly been more active, but by no means does that limit it to just those states that have perhaps Democratic majorities. We've seen Republican states sometimes mark out paths on the other side of the aisle, but still trying to tackle, I think, some of the same issues. So, and Teresa, you're on mute.
You'd think after several years of doing this that I would know how to turn my sound on and off. We've got a lot of questions coming in already, so we will get to those for sure. Can you talk through who some of the leaders have been in either creating change in this space or have kind of been taking the charge in maintaining the status quo?
Yeah, I mean, my home state of Maine, has really been a leader, and we'll talk a little bit more specifically later about what makes Maine unique. But between taking action on certain chemicals, establishing the first EPR law, Maine has been kind of a unique position. We're the state that gets the daylight first in the continental U.S., and the state motto is Dirigo. In Latin, that means I lead. And our legislature and at times our administrator, governor, have leaned into that philosophy that we can experiment on policy and we can lead in particular areas. Going back to the early 2000s on healthcare, the Dirigo healthcare system was, before Obamacare, before Massachusetts tried to do healthcare. Maine tried it and had to eventually repeal it and move forward in a different pathway. But Maine has had no aversion to sort of going first in the nation. I think over the last year, we've seen some interesting states step out a little bit more. Minnesota this year on a number of environmental policy issues marked new ground. I mentioned PFAS earlier. They passed a pretty groundbreaking PFAS law this year. They've obviously got new Democratic majorities in both chambers of the legislature. And California obviously has and continues to be a leader in many areas. This last year was more, I think, modifications, and they're going out of session, I think, on Thursday perhaps. I've got a colleague that's based in Sacramento, and it's been late hours and long nights out there in Sacramento right now. But it's been a year or more, I think, in California around adjustments to major groundbreaking laws that happened last year. And in California, there's a significant base of industry that is involved in crafting policy. And for those that know the California lobbying community, it's one of the best out there and one of the most tightly knit communities that have a level of expertise in policy that may not exist in some other states. So, California will always be a leader, but it is sometimes more consensus-based policy, where in other states we've seen, I would say, maybe slightly more reactionary policy that takes a particular perspective on an issue and wants to see if putting in place, strong regulation in some folks' eyes or punitive regulation and laws in other folks' eyes, if that's going to work or not. And we've seen this year in Maine, they had to do some reform to the PFAS law that passed, and on some of the other issues that we've really gotten out ahead of a little bit. There always are efforts to come back and try to revisit those. And it's going to be interesting to see. Michigan is still in session right now. I continue to hear that there's going to be an environmental agenda that starts to formalize this fall in Michigan as they go into next year, given their new majorities. And we saw Illinois is one of those states too that has really at times taken a long time to get around to policy, and on the issue related to extended producer responsibility, we saw them take a pretty significant step forward this year with establishing an advisory council and a needs assessment. Maryland did something first, very, very similar. Maryland has been a leader at times, but again, it's a state that has relatively large progressive majorities in the legislature that have the votes, but at times they're not always leaders as much. So, it's definitely been a year where we've seen a number of precedents, and obviously we'll continue to see that. But this year, I think in particular, there's been some adjustments on policies that passed in 2021 and in 2022.
Awesome. I want to dive into some of these questions that talk specifically about this issue before we dive into some of our other trends that we want to talk about today. And so one that I think is interesting. So Mark says his home state is Massachusetts, and PFAS has definitely been a heated issue, not just at the state level, but at the local level. Do you see this trend of chemical and solid waste being a primary state issue continuing, or potentially moving to the federal level?
Yeah, I think on PFAS, EPA has a work plan that they've published last year, and there's going to be more activity. But the scope of EPA's action plan is more limited than where the states are headed, and the definitions are different. So most of the state definitions would include somewhere between 12 and 14,000 chemicals, the way that the structure is set up. EPA is taking a look at a much smaller universe. So I think there will be some consistency at the federal level as they continue to work through that work plan. But as more and more tests come back showing the presence of PFAS in water supplies, here in Maine we had it's been something that certainly made the national news sort of over and over again. But a dairy farmer that had spread municipal solid waste sludge on his farm field resulted in his cows having PFAS in their milk, and generations of this farm have now gone out of business because of the presence of these chemicals. And so I think it is something similar to other chemicals of the past, like I mentioned, lead, asbestos. For those that remember it, MTBE was a fuel additive that was used particularly in New England around air emissions issues. We're going to have continual state regulation. And I think the trend too that folks have seen, if you can't achieve a policy at the federal or at the state level, obviously not a whole lot of policy at the federal level, go down to the local level and try to regulate chemicals. We've seen a little bit less of that because you really do have to take an agency at a state level that has some ability to regulate across the state and put a plan together to actually do the regulation. I've seen a little bit less, state by or city by city regulations. We've seen more resolutions at the local level, encouraging activity at the state level or encouraging activity at the federal level. But I think, when it comes to PFAS, it has, in a span of about 3 years, eclipsed all of the other sort of chemical interests. Folks, will remember, bisphenol A and phthalates and flame retardants. In pretty a unique way, I would say this class of chemicals, for better or for worse, there are definitely significant scientific issues that need to be looked into this on both sides of the issue. And it is eclipsed by far any other chemical issue at the state level. So I think it's here to stay. And I think it's something that will, continue to see experimentation and pullback in policy. I mentioned Minnesota passing a pretty significant law this year that copies Maine, but Maine had to go back and reform its law this year as well. So, and will be doing so moving forward. So I think it's absolutely here to stay at the state level for a significant number of years to come.
Awesome. And so we will get to more of these questions at the end, but I want to jump into our second trend, which is this idea of Maine as, like you described, a first in the nation state, a state that's willing to take on newer issues or try new methods of tackling a policy that other states maybe haven't dug into yet. And because we have folks on the call working across a number of issues, a number of states, want to even talk a little bit about, as a lobbyist or as an advocacy professional, if someone wants to work in Maine or a state that has this similar experimentation methodology, what's kind of the first steps to getting your issue or your policy out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and Don can probably weigh in, as you're bringing an issue to the legislature, right? It's always good to check in and have a discussion with leadership and the committee chairs of that particular issue, and have them identify who might be, the right legislature to carry that issue for you in particular. And, obviously, anytime you can bring sort of a solution to the legislature that has some buy-in, beyond just either an industry sector or an advocate group, has larger buy-in than just your organization is pretty critical. I think knowing the process in the state is incredibly important. As you go from state to state, the rules are different. The mechanics are the same, right? You've got typically, except Nebraska, 2 chambers. You've got committees that meet on particular issues, but Maine is unique in that sense. Our process is relatively convoluted, but it is, in my opinion, generally skewed towards passage, more so than other states. We have joint committees. Our rules, so there's only one policy bite at the apple in Maine. Our rules specify that every bill has to get a vote in committee, regardless of what leadership and the committee chairs feel about that particular bill. It has to get a vote. And that vote is automatically reported out to the floors of the sponsors of that legislation. So if it's a House bill, even if it was voted unanimously ought not to pass, that's the terminology here, voted to die, it still goes to the floor, and there's a chance for some mischief on the floor where, that sponsor might offer an amendment or try to move a different report out of committee. So our process is particularly inclined to look at passage of legislation. We have one sort of fallback. If there's a fiscal note on the bill, it'll have to go to our appropriations committee and get funded from available funds. So that's about the only stopping point. But if it can be argued, which we've seen often in Maine, where the particular program, particularly on environmental issues, can be done within existing resources, that's a phrase that shows up a lot in fiscal analysis. Those bills are very hard to stop if they've got a majority sponsor and leadership is not specifically invested against whipping against a bill. That's a challenging scenario to shut down without a fiscal note. Our governor has been, particularly moderate on some issues, but she is a Democrat and she's got Democratic majorities, so she has to pick some of her battles carefully around. Now she's in her first year of her second term, so she's term limited. We have term limits in Maine, so the idea that the legislature is able to develop a lot of experience, you're limited to 8 years in either chamber. Now you can bounce back and forth, and that has happened. We had a distinguished former speaker that would do that, but generally we don't have the level of experience. We also don't have professional staff dedicated to each legislator. There's caucus staff, there's committee staff, but our legislators don't have offices. They have a mailbox in their majority office, and the committee chairs have their committee office. But it's kind of policy on the fly a little bit for us, which is why Maine has that tendency. And there are other states that have similar tendencies. Massachusetts has joint committees as well, and every bill gets a vote. But Massachusetts is very hierarchically controlled, where leadership is able to orchestrate an agenda in a much more uniform way that doesn't necessarily exist in a state like Maine. So obviously, as you're bringing a new idea to a particular legislature, it's important to understand those dynamics walking in if you're from out of state, and that's always a challenging place to be in. And it's really important to understand those dynamics as you go in and have somebody that's local that's able to help bring a face to that particular issue.
Awesome. We are getting flooded with questions, and so I'm going to have us kick it over to Don and have Don walk us through his trends, and then open up for Q&A. So Don, I'll kick it over to you to share your screen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will do my best to not go through this PowerPoint. I'll go through fairly quickly. The first couple of pages are just a way for me to make myself look better. So we'll skip the introduction and go right into the issues page. And I think this was mentioned before, when you have a governor in their second term, they want to start thinking about legacy issues. So if you're in a state, the governor who's already done their first term, which they pretty much dedicate to all the campaign promises they made, and if they sort of fulfill those promises, if they have a state where they control both the House and Senate, they can usually do that. So their second term, they're looking at legacy things. In the state of Georgia, I think tort reform is going to be one of our top legacy issues for this particular governor, Brian Kemp. And I think you're going to see, and this was mentioned before, that trends happen because a lot of these legislators meet during the summer or other times at national conferences, whether it's a national conference of state legislatures or ALEC or other like conferences where they gather their ideas. They have legislators from all 50 states there. And typically what they do is if someone has a great idea, they want to copy it. And so if you see an issue happening in Maine or Boston, and it's a pretty popular issue, you might see that copied, especially in other blue states. And it's the same thing if you're in a red state. Once these legislators go to whatever conference and they meet with their counterparts in South Carolina and Alabama, I happen to be in Georgia, they start saying, hey, what worked, what didn't work, what was popular. And obviously you have states like Florida where you've got a governor running for president. So a lot of those issues sort of become nationalized. So in Georgia, I think we're going to see tort reform. One thing I did want to mention is that what I'm seeing as a trend generally is, while I'm doing lobbying work, more and more of my clients are bringing on comms teams at the same time. And I think there is an important component of when you're lobbying a bill, it's very helpful as a lobbyist to have positive or negative articles written depending on what you're trying to do about any particular issue. So I think what you're going to see in Georgia in tort reform, you're going to see the medical community, you're going to see the business community pushing pretty hard towards some significant torts, and then you're going to see trial lawyers, personal injury lawyers, that type of thing, fight them pretty hard. So I think what you're going to see, and if Georgia is successful in tort reform, you might see that happening in other states. You may have already seen it happen in many, many states that have sort of gone through this issue. And the other issue I wanted to talk about was education and literacy. We're seeing a lot of money we think that's going to be put in this sort of science of reading. Many of you may have heard about the Mississippi Miracle, where a few years ago, Mississippi sort of rethought their, I'm sorry, my line goes off automatically, rethought their entire reading program, and they spent a lot of money in early literacy, and it had a huge impact. And so now you're seeing a lot of states just copying what they're doing and what they did in Mississippi. And again, this sort of trend happens in one state. If it works, it's going to happen in other states. So if you're in a state that hasn't started this, or if you have clients related in the education space, I think you're going to see many, many states dump lots of money, millions upon millions of dollars, sort of rethinking the science of reading and going through this early literacy. And then the last big trend I want to mention is economic development. As you have probably seen, many, many states keep ramping up what they do from a tax credit standpoint. In Georgia, we are considered the Hollywood of the South now because of a very aggressive tax credit. In fact, there are now more productions going on in Georgia than in Hollywood and virtually any other place in the world, really. I think we actually outpaced London recently in the last count of how many productions were going on in Georgia, and that was all based on tax credit. So as you're working with clients that are trying to grow their industry, I think you really have to tell the tax credit story. In Georgia, there are a lot of huge credits related to the EV industry, electric vehicle industry. So you see Hyundai and Rivian and other folks coming, and then all the ancillary industries come with them. So again, I think you're going to see every state is going to continue to ramp up what they do from a tax credit standpoint, because they've got to compete with the Joneses, and they're going to try to continue to do that. And then one thing I want to talk about that may directly affect your industry, I joke that 20 years ago, the millionaires and billionaires were buying private jets and mega yachts, and now I think they're all turning their interest towards super PACs. And now you're seeing literally every very wealthy individual to large corporations have their own super PAC that, quite frankly, is what you call dark money. It's very hard to track this money, but you're seeing it more and more occurring, especially in elections where things might be very tight. If you have a state that's turning purple, either way, I think you're going to see more and more of these super PACs and these folks come in. And what that does for you, I think, in your industry is it puts a lot of resources and money in a space that's never been there. Typically, you know, when someone's running a campaign, they've got limited resources. They're trying to just get enough money to put something on TV. Now super PACs come in and suddenly there are literally hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars to do other things that campaigns haven't typically done. And most of these things are going to be in the comm space. It's going to be something where they're trying to identify earned media or paid media. They're trying to identify particular interest groups that can be driven. And then what sort of another offshoot on this, and I think this is really effective now, I think when we're looking at passage of legislation, is more and more different clients of mine are doing their own polling. And typically what you'll see is, you know, candidates poll all the time and they do all kinds of things. But when you can bring data to someone who's running for re-election about the popularity or unpopularity of any issue, it really moves the dial. So I think what you see is, and now that we have these super PACs sort of everywhere, there's a lot of money out there to pay for all of this private polling, which can be very, very expensive. So, you know, I see a lot of folks not just wanting to rely on just a core government relations or lobbying team, but I think they really want to build out their entire team to make sure they've got sort of a PR comms aspect going into it. And that's my last slide there. And I mentioned a little about dark money. So I didn't want to take up too much time, but I did want to mention those things in particular to this group. I'm going to unshare here. I think. Just trying to unshare my screen.
I think if, let's see here. I think right above where it says leave stage, there's a stop sharing button in gold on the lower right. There we go. Awesome.
But I want to mention a few of those items.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And thank you both for all of that information. I think we could have gone on for another half hour or so, but I want to make sure I get through some of these questions. So I'm going to scroll through these. If folks have more, feel free to send them and we will get through as many as we can. One question that I saw earlier that I thought was helpful was, can you talk about how to navigate multi-state advocacy efforts in such diverse environments? So if you're working on an issue that is impacted in many states, but there's different political dynamics all over the place, how do you kind of scale your operation so you're not creating a new strategy for every state?
I can jump in there. I mean, it's good to have a consistent sort of national policy. You know, I've written model bills, you know, on a number of different issues, but they do change in every state. You know, and so I think having an idea of an outline of your objective and having loose concepts that define that objective that can then be adapted in each state is pretty important. You know, at times you're fighting for maybe small provisions in a larger bill, but you know, having that national approach is helpful. But then you know, you do have to tailor it per state, and you know, there's continual, I think, effort for folks that are trying to sell a product or a service nationally to say, can't we get, you know, greater consistency? You know, I've seen some successful efforts with interstate compacts and ability to try to take things to you know, different third parties that sort of, you know, nationally try to address the issue and get model legislation out in particular states. There's obviously organizations that look at suggested state legislation. The Council of State Governments now has had for a number of years, you know, innovative ideas to address particular issues that they put in a compendium. You know, there are other organizations that go across, you know, different states that have model bills and model policy. But I've found that those are sometimes effective, but it's better to know your issue, to have defined outcomes, and I think approach each state, unless it's something that every state has to deal with in a particular year. If it's some air quality reauthorization or something that has to get done in a particular year, like tax conformity, was certainly something after the tax changes that took place under the Trump administration. You knew states were going to have to figure out in that 1 year to 2 year period if they were going to conform their tax code to the federal code or not. So that's a little bit of a different issue. But if it's an industry or an advocacy group specific type of issue, you're not going to have the same sort of time clock. So you have to create, the ability to approach states with something that's adaptable for their particular needs, but does link back to some of your core overall principles. So it's not easy, and that's the reason why those of us that are in individual states have jobs, is because each state is always going to look at policy a little bit differently. But if you're not members of a trade association, or if you are at a trade association, you've got to get consensus within your industry, or from an advocate group's perspective, get consensus among your stakeholders. But coming up with that general framework that is still adaptable at the state level is about the only way I think you can really do that.
And I would just add to that, and this is going to sound self-serving, but it's very difficult to ramp up in a state, especially a large state, if you've never been there before. And while I know some companies or organizations don't have the resources to be in every state, I would say certain states that are large, you might want to have a presence in, because it's very difficult to ramp up. And unless you're willing to spend a significant amount of money with the Republican Governors Association, the Democrat Governors Association, you got to be involved with the Attorney General's associations. Unless you're willing to spend those resources at the national level, which are expensive, I think to some degree you're better off making sure you have some presence in some of the important states where you're doing business in.
And I would completely agree with Don on that point. There's a lot of activity in the summertime around, the circuit or those meetings that happen. I have never found a chance meeting or spending some time with a particular legislative leader, even if we have a great connection in a state, result in, your bill is guaranteed. You've got to have, either a company locally or council in a particular state. If you're building an issue from the ground up, or if you've got, a local chapter, think about some of the public health organizations that have local chapters in each state, you've got to have a waterfront in that state. And, there are some states that are easier to I think, establish credibility and ability to speak to an issue than others, but, a state like New York or Massachusetts, walking in off the street, and testifying, they're like, who are you? And, why do we care? Georgia may be the same, but I've never had to do that in Georgia. But, not trying to be self-serving, you can be effective to a point, but if it's a make or break issue, for your industry, for your organization, for a cause that you're working for, at the end of the day, you've got to have somebody that will champion that issue all the way through the legislative process, and will show up on the last day, at 11 o'clock, when, within the agenda of legislative leadership, there are 5 things that have to get done, and this is the 6th thing that has to get traded with something else in order to get it done. Like, unless it's a really simple issue that gets cleared out of session early, the bigger picture stuff is done late in session, and you won't know until the end. So you really do need, at a minimum, like a company or a chapter or somebody that will be there to bird dog most of these issues.
Awesome. John, a question for you based on some of your slides. Liz asks, with so much polling going on in election years and during legislative session, how do you ensure credibility for your issue poll?
So what I would do, and what I recommend to my clients, is hire the pollster of the majority party. A handful of pollsters they trust. And since they're already doing a poll for the governor or lieutenant governor or speaker or whoever, you can pay for an augmentation of that poll to make sure it covers your issue specifically. And so if it says the governor has a 53% approval rating and that matches what the governor's internal polling has, they're going to trust everything else in the poll. And so I would say hire the pollsters that the leaderships are currently using.
I would agree totally with that.
Awesome. Joshua asks, when it comes to creating relationships and maintaining relationships with legislators and their staffers, what have you found best to maintain those relationships?
I mean, and I'll let Don speak, but from my perspective, I think persistence is important, but politeness too. I've seen folks way overdue. Like, you have a good meeting, and within a day or so, you've got 4 emails with multiple reports, and you overwhelm somebody. So I think knowing your timing and polite persistence is important. Staffers are obviously the first, I think, point of contact after a positive meeting or interaction is to circle back with staff. The legislator is going to move on to other things and get distracted. They're a mile wide and an inch deep. I think a lot of folks have heard that phrase, and the staffer is the one that will likely carry that issue forward to the next thing. But having targeted, focused follow-up that's persistent but not overwhelming, and even if it was a good meeting, you have to be careful about trying to put words in somebody's mouth if they were positive on an issue, but perhaps not 100% committal. You have to be sensitive to the fact that you don't box somebody in your follow-up where you heard one thing and they felt like they didn't go that far. It's going to take a number of different meetings and interactions to deliver actual commitment to moving a bill or making this issue a priority, where if you don't really think about what you heard and overplay your hand in that follow-up, it's important to be sensitive to the fact that you can completely spoil that interaction and that relationship if you try to say, we agreed that this bill will be a priority. If that's not what the Senate president agreed to or felt like he agreed to, you're done. So,
yeah, what I'd add, and look, I mean, we can't overlook the fact that money is part of politics. Candidates are always raising money. It's something that never goes away. It is a piece of it, but it's not the only important piece. I'd say a critical piece for me, especially I work with a lot of trade associations, is if I can identify a member that can actually vote for that legislator, it makes all the difference in the world. They will sit down with literally anybody in their district for a coffee, a lunch, or whatever it is. So if you work with a company, you work with a client, they probably have a presence in that state. If they can identify local folks who can actually sit down with their legislator, it's going to mean a heck of a lot more, because the point of giving them money is to get the votes. But if you put someone in the room that can actually vote for them, that actually expresses the ability to get 10 or 20 more votes in their district, that makes all the difference in the world.
Awesome. Don, I'll start with you on this question. So the question is, how do you deal with an outside group like the Metro Atlanta Chamber of Commerce? They seem to have an outsized influence to be able to make or break bills. But I guess I'll broaden the question a little bit to how do you deal with the competitive landscape in a state when you've got someone on the other side that's well-resourced? And how do you kind of make yourself feel bigger than you maybe are if you're not the highest paying player in the game?
Yeah, so I'd go back to the force multiplier military adage. Again, if I represent insurance agents, I may not be the most important player, and they probably don't give a lot of money, but I probably have a lot of people on the ground. If you're willing to go and put people at their districts, attend their meetings, if you're willing to put just numbers out there as far as actual voters, that's the difference maker. The chambers are great, but they typically are represented by people who are presidents of their companies. They're not spending that personal time with those legislators. And in the day, if you think about how few people actually vote in primaries, and most House and Senate districts are really in districts that are either very red or very blue, you're talking about a 20% turnout. So it means a lot. I would just go back to that adage of, if I could put actual voters in front of them, I'll have a better chance than the president of Company X.
And I think, doing your homework outside of session, like, this time of year, and then, for most states, and I know there are a few states that have elections this year, like New Jersey and others, but Virginia. But, in a year like this year, as most states are out of session, this is when, you need to be having your constituents go in. If there is an outsized influence with a particular, significant entity, this is the time where you make, hey, it's not during, I mean, it is during session when it comes down to brass tacks, you've got to carry that through, but it's the homework that you do now prior to session that's really the game changer with the same folks that Don's talking about.
Awesome. And so I want to just give one wrap-up question, as I know you both have busy days ahead. Looking ahead to 2024, with most, not all, but most states having concluded sessions this year, folks are in their planning stage for next year. What's kind of the thing that you are thinking about doing differently, or is your primary focus of 2024 based on what you experienced this year in your respective states?
Don, you want to kick that one off?
Yeah, so in Georgia and in many states, a lot of legislatures do study committees or other activities that are around their planning stages for the 2024 session. So, I have my clients very engaged in those study committees, testifying before them, meeting with them, helping them shape those policy ideas. Because at the end of the day, the worst thing you can do is ask someone to sponsor a bill the first day of the session. You really need to do all those asks now. So we're building out who our sponsors are for various pieces of legislation. If we know there's a bill coming up that we're opposed to, we're building the groundwork for why we don't want that bill to pass. And so some of that is media related too. If we can get negative stories written about, what happens when this is passed in other states, if I can show and demonstrate that this is going to make you look bad in some way, shape, or form, legislators will stay away from it. If I can keep someone from not sponsoring a bill, it's pretty powerful. And if the person trying to pass a bill that you're opposed to, which quite frankly is what you do most of the time, passage of bills, as Andrew said, it's tough. But stopping bills is probably what you do a majority of your time as a lobbyist. And so you want to build those coalitions of folks say, I'm not going to touch that with a 10-foot pole. I'm going to stay away from that issue. And if you can build that now, there's no way they want to take it on in January, February, whenever their session starts.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that. In Maine, we've had a significant number of issues that got carried over till next year because we had an abortion fight this year, and we had a huge fight on paid family medical leave that both ended up passing, but sucked a lot of oxygen and a lot of time out of the legislature. So our issues are quite frankly, in a large portion, carrying into next year. We've got interim committee meetings, like Don mentioned, task forces that are starting to meet, literally next week through the end of the year. And, around those issues, working with our Chamber of Commerce and others, we are starting a communications, campaign on a number of different issues to try to surround the issue before we get into, actual votes again on some of these bills. And we do have the ability, I think one of the questions that I answered in the chat, next year for us, bills carry over if they've been officially carried over. New bills can be introduced, but they have to go through our legislative council, which is the leadership of both parties, both chambers, so democratically controlled vis-a-vis, the control of our legislature, and they have to vote whether or not the bill is an emergency or not. So that's not typically always the true rule. It's whether or not they want to let something in or not. And typically in the second year, when you've got Democrats controlling the legislative council, you get more Democratic bills in than Republican bills. But next year is going to feel a lot like just a continuation of this year for us in Maine. So.
Wonderful. And that brings us full circle to our state trends report that brought a lot of folks onto this webinar, where we see in even numbered years, the number of bills introduced is dropping a lot, but the number of bills passing is still staying consistent. So folks are diving into those bills that are carrying over in states that do have that process. Want to thank both Andy and Don for joining us today, and for all of our attendees for really active conversation. This was really great, and something I think that we will do again in the future with this much conversation around state trends. Want to give a quick plug for those who are tracking a wide variety of issues or working across a number of states. That Quorum's state legislative tracking product can help make some of that process easier. If you'd like to learn more, you can visit our website at quorum.us. Otherwise, keep your inbox open. We've got some more webinars coming up in October. And the end of October is Quorum's flagship event, Wonk Week. And so keep an eye on your inbox for invites to Wonk Week. We are doing an in-person component this year at the AT&T Policy Forum where folks can purchase tickets to attend some exclusive sessions. So keep a lookout for that. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.